I mean, a lot of times people shy away from it because it's such a prophetical book and there's so much imagery in it, and it's like, it's too difficult to understand, so why even go there? But on the other side, then people go the other route and they look at the book of Revelation, and all of a sudden they've got all the world's problems figured out. I understand exactly when the end times are coming and what all this means that, and that means this and this. In reality, it is a very difficult book to understand. We're going to take a look at, in this series, the first 3 chapters. In the first 3 chapters, Jesus is addressing the church, the overall church, in 7 different letters that he dictates. Now, I got to ask you guys a question as we go forward. How many of you today, at some point, will be in Myers doing some shopping? Old Fred would be very happy with you. Well, Myers, it's a huge store, and I know many of you, or some of you, have worked for it. Fred Myers, when he started off back in 1934, I think it was, he started off in the grocery business, but then in '62 he took off on this concept of being able to get everything, or a lot of what you need in a super center sort of way. So this concept, as we know, took hold and kind of grew into what it is today. How many billions of dollars does Myers generate in a year? You know? Huh? Well, some of you Myers guys.
Just throw on a little.
How many?
300.
He's generating right now about $15 billion in annual sales. Now that's a ton of money. That's a ton of money. And we know the story behind Myers and all that he's done, and the number of stores, I think, is over 200 now, and they got stores in Michigan and Indiana and Ohio and all over the place. At his semi-retirement stage, what did Fred Myers do? One of the things he did, interesting enough, was he would go into different stores unannounced, didn't know what, he knew nobody would recognize him, and he got the old shopping cart and he'd go shopping to see what the heck was going on in his stores. He was following this. There's a principle in business that you always follow, and that is you inspect what you expect. Always do that. Because if you don't, what happens? Chaos. People might think they're doing the right thing when really they're not. Unless you inspect it to see what's going on, things just get bad, and they go from bad to worse. So Fred Myers would get in the shopping cart, or get a shopping cart, not in the shopping cart, I guess he could, but he would get a shopping cart. And what do you think it would be like to be the person who's worked at Myers for the last 10 years, and you're working the customer service counter today, and here comes this old gray-haired old geezer, and he's got an open box, and he says, and I don't have the receipt. What are you going to do? Fred Myers did these things because he wanted to see what the heart of his people, of his stores, was all about. He wanted to see whether or not people were taking forward and doing, the way things were intended to be done. He wanted to be an owner of a store and a chain that was responsive to people and was friendly and welcoming and easy to do business with and all those things. So Fred Myers would go from store to store, and he would check it out. Makes sense, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, guess what? God does inspections too. God pulls a Fred Myers on the church. And he's done it for centuries. For centuries. That's what these 7 letters are all about. Is God's inspection of what's going on. There's many examples in the Old Testament and the New Testament of where God looks into the heart of his people. Not just the Israelites, but into the heart of the people that live in all of these other cities. And in all of His creation, God is constantly monitoring what they do and what they don't do and why they do something. Why are you doing that? And why you didn't do something. You see, God is always investigating. He's always inspecting what it is that He expects. Some good classic examples of that are like the Pharaoh in the story of the Exodus. You know, everybody struggles with that one. Well, God hardened the Pharaoh's heart. Well, that's because He knew Pharaoh's heart. He knew how Pharaoh felt and what he would do and what decisions he would make. He knew that Pharaoh didn't care about him and wasn't afraid of him and all that. See, He knew the heart of people. He knows the heart of each and every one of you and me. God is always inspecting. He's always inspecting what He expects. Now we know that this book of Revelation is a very symbolic book. It's difficult to understand at many times. And it's a book, though, that's filled with justice. You see, that's one of the areas that a lot of times people don't really want to get involved with, is the justice aspect of God. We like the love and the mercy side, but we got to remember He's a God of justice too. And that one sometimes is difficult to take, difficult to understand. But it certainly is addressed in the letters that He writes to the churches. Now, this book of Revelation was written by John, not John the Baptist, it was John the disciple. That's what church history tells us. Now, according to church history, John, they attempted to boil him in oil. Now, it's church history, it's not in the Bible, but it says that at some point when John was proclaiming Jesus as Lord, you know, the Romans or maybe the religious leaders, they really don't know the details of it. But they tried to execute him somehow with hot or burning oil. Church history says that it didn't happen. Now, whether he was maimed or whether it just didn't work, it was one of those, you know, Bendigo type of things, you know, where you walk through the fire and it didn't hurt. I don't know. We really don't know. But John was the author, eventually exiled to the island of Patmos, and John was the author of this book that tells us so much about what it is to come. To the angel of the church in Ephesus, these are the words of Him who holds the 7 stars in His right hand and walks among the 7 golden lampstands. These next 4 words should run chills down your spine. He says, I know your deeds. He says, I know what's going on. I am not a foolish God. What He's saying in this scripture here is that I am the one that walks amongst your churches. I am the one that walks through your church. I see what's going on, not only in the church, but in your own heart and in your own attitude. He says, I'm the one that's at your board meetings. I'm the one that's in the parking lot when you gather after church and you're making comments. I'm the one that's with you at lunchtime. He says, I'm the one that is with you at night when you say your prayers. He says, I am the God that walks amongst you. And He represents the church and the people of the church in a lampstand. Among the 7 stars, He holds in His right hand and walks among the 7 golden lampstands. The stars are angels that God has appointed to watch over the churches. The 7 golden lampstands are the 7 major churches that were in Asia Minor back in those days, as after Jesus had left and gone into heaven. And that's what these letters are addressed to. These letters are addressed to these churches. Now we're starting off here with, I wanted you to see, kind of gives you a perspective here of a world map. And then here's Asia Minor, and you can see that there's 7 different churches that are listed. It kind of goes up and it comes back down in a loop. Those were the major players in the church worldwide back then. Theology was coming out of those churches. Instruction was coming out of those churches. You know, empowerment and encouragement to some of the other smaller churches. all of those things were coming out of these major churches that Jesus addresses in the book of Revelation. Go to the next one. This kind of gives you another bird's eye view of what it looks like. This is maybe a little bit harder to read, but these are those 7 churches again that Jesus is going to address. Go to the next one. This is an overall map of the city of Ephesus. We're going to start in Ephesus. Can you dim those center lights? Maybe it'll make it easier to see. Is that a little bit better? Okay. I want you to take special note of this little building right here. Okay, it is called the Celsus Library. And I want you to pay attention to the size of this structure compared to everything else. Okay, how many of you have ever been to Ephesus? All of you? You've been there? Cool. I'm jealous. So we're going to take a walk through the city of Ephesus, and we're going to see what kind of things are there. Keep going to the next one. This is a walk down, it's called Curates Street, in Ephesus, going toward one of the temples down there. And it kind of gives you a perspective of what you're looking at. Lots of ruins. A lot of this has been destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed over the centuries. A lot of it looted, all kinds of things. But this is one of the streets that you would walk down as you visited Ephesus. Go to the next one. This is the Temple of Artemis. This, in the world back then, this was one of the wonders of the world. And the reason I say that is because of the structure itself. This Temple of Artemis was a massive structure. And when you look at the size of the stones and all of those things that they built, the architecture, when you look at just the dynamics of how the thing stood, or how they got the stones, that high up into the air, and it was a wonder of the world. You can see at the top here, these are the ruins that are left here today. Again, this temple was destroyed several different times and rebuilt several different times. And over here is the god Artemis that is on display in a British museum right now. That's actually one of the statues that they had of Artemis. You can see that Artemis is a female, many breasts. The reason for that is Artemis was a god of fertility, abundance, a god of life. You see, in that culture back then, if you were getting ready to plant a crop, what you would do is you would go to the Temple of Artemis and you would offer a sacrifice to Artemis so that you would have a bumper crop. I mean, it would just be abundant. Everything would go great. You'd have stuff overflowing. That's what you prayed for. That's what you gave an offering for. If you were getting ready to have a baby, you again would go to the Temple of Artemis and offer a sacrifice that your child would be healthy and strong and have a great life ahead of them and all that. Again, you offered a sacrifice so that you got something back. If you were getting ready to go on a hunt, the hunt party, they would again go to the Temple of Artemis and offer a sacrifice so that the hunt itself would be fruitful. It would be a blessing. You can go to the next one. This is the theater in Ephesus, a massive structure. The city of Ephesus itself held about 250,000 people. This theater here holds about 25,000 people. Now the theater was a center of culture, it was a center of politics. They had all kinds of drama and arts and all kinds of different things that took place in that particular theater. Sporting events, social things, all kinds of stuff. Go to the next one. This is a street view of what that looks like. You can, again, kind of get a glimpse of how massive this place is. Go ahead. Now you remember on that diagram of Ephesus, I told you to remember that little teeny building? This is the entrance to that library. So again, you can see, just to kind of give you some perspective on the size of the buildings and how massive this city of Ephesus is. Quite a massive structure. That library there alone was one of the centers, one of the wonders of the world in regards to knowledge. It held over 12,000 different scrolls. You know, those great big scrolls that they used to use, and they would print everything on papyrus paper and roll them up in these scrolls. They had all of these spots in there that hold 12,000 of those different scrolls. Ephesus was also kind of a very sensual place to live. Go to the next one. They had community bathhouses, and they had pools, and they had warm houses and saunas, and they had all kinds of things there that were all community-based. As you can imagine, it was a difficult scenario to be a Christian in the city of Ephesus. Why was that? It was because there were many, many, many different gods and different temples and different worship sites throughout the city. If you wanted to, you were going to go into a business deal, there was probably, 2 or 3 different gods that you could go and offer a sacrifice to somewhere. There was all kinds of gods. This was a very pagan city to live in. If you were a Christian, though, if you were a Christian, you're now saying that Jesus is Lord, not Caesar. Well, first of all, that'll get you in trouble. You could end up on a cross. You could end up in prison. But what took place a lot of times for the Christians in this early church was they were kind of outcasts from society. Your neighbors, all of a sudden they didn't see you at the temple of Artemis anymore because, hey, Joe, he's a Christian now. Really? Man, when did he start that stuff? And they looked at the Christians, or they looked at this Jesus movement as a cult. Kind of put it in perspective. Today we're Christians and we look at other cults that are out there. Well, they looked at us the same way. They said, wait a minute, we all go to the temple of Artemis. We all, the whole family, grandma, and mom and dad, and all the kids, we all go there to offer a sacrifice every year. What do you mean Joe's not there? He's not coming this year. Oh, he's a Christian now. What? What's wrong with him? It was a difficult place to be a Christian. It could get you killed. Most of the time, people quit doing business with you. Oh, Joe's a carpenter. He usually, he does good work and all, and everybody in the city knows him, and he's always been quite busy, but now he's a Christian. I'm not dealing with him anymore. So it can cost you your livelihood. Now you had to worry about, well, how am I going to feed my family? Being a Christian in this church was extremely, extremely difficult. A very paganistic society. And Jesus says, I know your deeds, your hard work, and your perseverance. I know that you cannot tolerate wicked people. He's giving them a thumbs up. He says that you have tested those who claim to be apostles but are not, and have found them false. He says, right on, man. Yeah, don't let anybody deceive you. You have persevered. That's the word I want etched inside of your hearts today, is perseverance. He says, you have persevered and have endured many hardships for my name and have not grown weary. We look at the church of Ephesus, and Jesus is doing this Fred Myers thing on this church. And he says, I'm inspecting what I expect. And what I have found is that, yes, you are persevering through so much hardship. People that are saying that they're leaders, they're saying that they're disciples and apostles, you're checking them out and you're seeing who's true and who's not. And he says, I commend you for that. It's hard stuff. He says, but I commend you. Perseverance is one of those qualities or character traits that is very difficult. Don't you think? Don't we give up sometimes quickly? Now, you know, I'm not in the best physical shape. And how many diets have I been on? I don't know, you could probably tell me, but perseverance is the key, isn't it? Yeah. And Jesus is looking at this church and they're saying to this group of growing individuals, they weren't meeting at these temples. These Christians were meeting in houses, in home churches, and they were growing. And the division between the culture and most of the people there and this small group of Christians, it was growing. It was becoming bad. And Jesus says, I know your deeds. I know what you're putting up with. I know what you're doing, and these are some of the things that are right. And you're doing them because of perseverance. Watch this.
40 years ago, on October 13th, 1972, 45 people boarded a chartered flight out of Argentina headed for Chile. Only 16 survived. The flight, occupied by a young Uruguayan rugby team, along with friends and family members, crashed into a desolate valley within the Andes Mountains. With nothing but scraps of food, a few bottles of wine, and small amounts of clothing to keep from dying in the negative 30 below temperatures, the survivors quickly ran out of food and began to succumb to injuries, hypothermia, and malnutrition. In a remarkable act of bravery, 2 men from the surviving passengers climbed their way through 38 miles of mountainous terrain for 10 days in beat-up rugby boots to finally find help for the 14 survivors left behind.
Can you imagine the perseverance that those 2 people must have endured, went through, and had inside of their hearts? I mean, they spent 10 days and 38 miles, totally unequipped for the conditions, and yet they persevered until they got help for those people. And what did they say? 16 survived? See, Jesus is telling the church today, perseverance is one of the ways that you're going to be successful. It's one of the ways that you're going to continue to do the things that I've preordained for you to do. It's one of the things that you need to hold on to with all of your heart if you're going to walk with me. He says the world hates me and they will hate you. And guess what? You're going to need perseverance in order to go through, in order to endure. Perseverance is one of those things that is difficult. I think perseverance, and the kind of perseverance that I have to emulate here in the life that I live, and I got it pretty easy, really. You know? But people around the world, people in some of these other countries that are persecuted and have to worry about where they're gathering, and just wearing a shirt that says Jesus on it, that's perseverance. So what about you? How's the perseverance in your life? Do you persevere with God when He asks you to do something difficult? Do you persevere when God gives you somebody that He says, hey, I'd like you to minister to this person? Or God says, I've got another difficult challenge for you. There's somebody that needs a shoulder to cry on. Someone that needs to hear about me, maybe. Do you persevere? Or do you shy away? The easiest thing for those rugby players to have done was probably simply give up. But they persevered. And Jesus commends the church. He says, when you're doing the things that I've called you to do, when you stand up and are a witness for me, it's going to take a lot of perseverance. Dear Lord, I pray that this week we would ponder what that word perseverance means. And I pray that we would understand that it means that we can endure all things through you and with you and through your power and strength. And that you'll never call upon us to do something that we would totally be overwhelmed with. but you will always provide the strength and encouragement and the guidance, all that is necessary for living as a Christian in a world that is totally against you. So Lord, we thank you for that. And we pray that you'll walk with us this week. In the name of Jesus. Amen. Now next week, we're going to continue in the book of Revelation. We're going to continue to look at the church of Ephesus, because at this point the news is good. I commend you. You're persevering. You know, you're checking people out, all that. But next week,